Chapter 32. It was almost 10 before Matt convinced Alex it was time for bed. He knew she was tired, especially after she'd fallen asleep watching TV earlier, but she was stubborn. She kept insisting she wasn't tired, and she wasn't ready to go to bed yet. He kind of understood it. She'd been stuck in her bedroom for days, and now that she was out of it, she probably didn't want to go back. "How about a different room tonight? We could sleep in the bedroom you want me to take." He snuck a look at her from the corner of his eye. Test it out and make sure it's comfortable. He didn't really think it would work, but he'd been trying to convince her to go to bed for the last hour. She turned to face him and blinked, her face blank. "You really think that's gonna work?" "It was worth a try," he said with a slight smile. "I'll tell you what. If you help me change the sheets, then we can go to bed. But I need clean sheets." She watched him. "To hell with helping. Tell me where they are, I'll just change them. If you'd said something earlier, it would already be done." Together they went upstairs. She showed him where she kept the linens. She reached for them, but he saw the tightening of her face. "Let me do that." He pulled out a set, closed the closet door and headed for the bedroom, with Alex right behind him. "Sit down, I'll take care of this." He motioned to the chair where her mother had sat off and on over the last few days, and waited until she did as she was told, before setting the sheets on top of the dresser and stripping the bed. "It would be faster if you'd let me help you." "I can do it quick enough, I've had lots of practice." "It would be more fun watching you do it if you were naked." He stopped and stared at her a moment. She just grinned. Shaking his head, he pulled his t-shirt off over his head and tossed it into the pile with the dirty sheets. "That'll have to do for now. I'll take what I can get." Her eyes followed his every movement as he put the clean sheets on the bed and finished making it. But he didn't get the sense she was making sure he was doing it right, more that she was enjoying watching him move. It was a little weird, but he could get into it, especially to see her smile like that. He had no doubt where her mind was, as he finished putting her pillows into clean cases and tossed them at the head of the bed. "You climb in, I'm gonna go shower real quick." He went into the attached bathroom without looking back. After his shower he toweled off, then wrapped his towel around his waist, and went in the bedroom. Alex was lying in bed, facing the bathroom door with the sheet pulled up under her arms. She had her head propped up on one hand, and had obviously been waiting for him. As the steam cloud erupted around him, he saw a smile spread across her face. There was no other word for the way she looked at him but predatory. His heart raced and his cock twitched. "Down boy, she's still injured," he thought to his wayward dick, as he walked around the bed. She rolled to keep her eyes on him. Reaching the side where he'd been sleeping, he bent to dig a pair of underwear from his suitcase sitting there. "No, leave them off," she said. He stood and looked at her, wanting to be able to see her face. "You sure?" He'd been wearing his underwear while they were in bed since he'd gotten here. It wasn't modesty, more that he didn't want her to be uncomfortable with him there. He wanted her to feel safe, like he could behave himself. It hadn't been difficult while she was wounded, but now she was almost healed, and his body had decided she was healed enough. He didn't know if he could keep himself from getting hard. She slid one hand across the bed toward him. "I'm sure. Get in here." He thought about it a second, then decided she's a big girl and not inexperienced. She likely knows what she's getting into. Shrugging, he tugged the towel free, draped it over his open suitcase to dry, then slid into bed beside her. Moving closer, he found that, like always before, she wore nothing. But unlike before, she felt up to more than just sleeping. She moved until she lay curled against him, laid her head on his shoulder, and ran one hand over his stomach and up over his chest. He wrapped one arm around her and enjoyed the feel of her there beside him, letting her pet him for several minutes. When she started teasing his nipples, one then the other, he couldn't keep himself from reacting. With his free hand he trapped hers against his chest and looked down at her face. "You are a troublemaker. Stop." "What if I don't want to?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "You're hurt. We're not doing this." "Are you sure?" She slipped her hand out from under his and continued to draw abstract designs on his skin with her fingertip. "I'm sure." He tried to grab her hand again, but she pulled away before he could capture it. "JV told me I was good to do anything I felt like doing, as long as it wasn't too strenuous and didn't pull at my wounds." She picked her head up and rested her chin on his shoulder. It wasn't the most comfortable thing, but he wouldn't ask her to move for the world. Closing his eyes, he counted to 10 then sighed. He knew he'd lost this one. "Promise to stop and tell me if anything hurts?" "Anything." Opening his eyes, he found her grinning at him. "Of course." "Don't make me regret this," he warned. Her smile just grew as she went back to running her fingertips over his chest. He watched her. She was up to something, he had no doubt. She ran her hands over his chest for a while, teasing his nipples as she ran over them, but not spending a lot of time or attention there. Then her hand dipped below the sheet that came just above his waist. She ran her hand down one leg then up the other, skimming over his balls but never touching his penis. Her hand never stopped moving. Laying still and letting her set the pace was becoming more and more difficult. Tucking his free hand under his hip, he closed his eyes and tried to relax, to keep from thinking about what she was doing and when would she touch that part that ached so bad. He nearly shot off the bed when her mouth closed over his nipple, hot and wet. Instead he stiffened, unable to hold back the groan that leaked from his throat. He gritted his teeth and tightened the arm around her, pulling her against him. Her tongue flicked over and over the sensitive tip while her hand flattened against his stomach. The hand under his hips came up and wrapped around her wrist while his back arched. He didn't know how much longer he could take laying back and letting her set the pace. When the hand on his stomach slid lower, pushed the blanket down, and her small hand wrapped around his cock and squeezed, he almost lost it then and there, embarrassing himself in the process. "Stop," he gasped. "Stop." He pulled her hand away from his manhood and struggled for control. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking up at him. "Baby, it's been a really long time and my control is not what it should be. I need a break." "Oh." She looked disappointed. "I said I need a break, sweetheart, not that we have to stop." "What do you mean?" She tilted her head to one side. Instead of answering, he shifted until he could lower his mouth to hers and kissed her. He rolled her until she lay on her back, and he was on his knees above her. "I mean, I need to not have you touching me for a little bit, not that I can't touch you." "Oh." Her eyes flicked down his body, then she looked back at his eyes. "I guess I can live with that." "I hope so." He kissed her again, then trailed kisses down her neck and along her shoulder. Skimming one hand down her body, he did the same with his mouth, kissing and licking along the way. When he reached her breasts, he paused and leaned back so he could use both hands to cup them both. He rolled the tips between his fingers and thumbs, making Alex moan. Her head fell back against the pillow and her eyes closed. He felt a small smile curve his lips as he used a little more pressure on her nipples, watching her face to gauge her reaction. Her back arched and she pushed her chest into his hands as if her body was begging for more. Leaning down, he took one tight nipple into his mouth, sucking and flicking the tip back and forth with his tongue. Her hands found and gripped his shoulders. He was okay with that, but when they started to move, he couldn't take it. He reached up and grabbed her wrists, then sat up, leaving her breasts naked. He leaned up and wrapped her hands around the bars of her headboard. "Leave them there." He looked her in the eyes. "If you move them, I'll stop again. Understand?" Yeah, she breathed. Satisfied she'd keep her hands where he put them, at least for now, he went back to her breasts. Using both hands he kneaded and squeezed the mounds, gauging from her reaction when he had just the right amount of pressure to make her crazy. He licked and nipped at the tips with his teeth until she was thrashing on the bed, begging for more. Moving on, he kissed and caressed his way down her stomach, sliding the sheet down as he went, exposing each bit of skin an inch at a time. He licked and bit at each new bit, enjoying the way she groaned and twitched. Please, she said, her voice husky and full of need. Please what? He looked up along her body, never lifting his head from where his tongue had just dipped into her belly button. Touch me. I am. He ran his tongue in a wide swath across her belly, then blew on her wet skin, making her shiver. You're torturing me. No, I'm learning you. He kissed her hip bone. Learning what you like, what makes you desperate. He pulled the sheet down, exposing her core. Nudging her legs apart, he blew a light breath across her damp opening. What makes you squirm? He chuckled as her hips moved, arching toward him as if begging for more. Make me scream, Matt, please. Her hand clenched the rods on the bed, and he thought he heard them groan. He wondered if they would hold. Spreading her legs wide, he dipped his head and licked the length of her slit. The taste of sweet honeyed cream exploded on his tongue at the same time as two loud pops echoed through the room. What was that? He looked up, worried. Alex turned pink and held up her hands, still clasped around the bars he'd wrapped them around. He took them and tossed them to the floor beside the bed. I'll fix it or replace it later. He took her hands and held them in each of his, as he went back to what he'd been doing. His face buried between her legs, he licked, sucked and gently bit, until her hands clenched in his, her back arched and she screamed as she came against his mouth. He drank in every drop, enjoying her sweet taste, then sat back and took in her half-lidded stare and lazy grin. You're good. He smiled and crawled up her body. Oh, we're just getting started. How's the wound? He ran his hand over the fresh pink skin. It looks better than it did even an hour ago. She didn't bother to look but ran one hand over the bright pink scars. Does it? How does it feel? Good, I can't even feel it right now. I'll take that as good. He ran his hand over the scars again, wondering over her sudden burst of healing. So, how do you want to do this? Do what? She smiled up at him with a lazy smile. He lifted one brow. Are you done? Oh, that. Her smile spread into a grin. She sat up and skimmed her hand down his chest. I have something in mind. Flattening one hand against his chest, she pushed him back until he was laying on his back against the pillows, then straddled his hips. It probably hasn't been as long for me as it has been for you, but I think we can muddle through. He fought the urge to flip her onto her back and take over. She ran her hands down his chest, then bent forward until their lips met. He brought his hands up to her sides as she opened her mouth against his and drew him into a sensual kiss. Her hands played along his skin, inflaming his senses. His hands shifted to cup her breasts, kneading and caressing as she kissed him. After several minutes, she shifted, still not breaking the kiss. Her hips moved until the slick heat of her opening rested against the tip of his manhood. He groaned into her mouth as she pushed herself down onto him. Breaking the kiss, she sat up, using her weight to help her sink down over him until her hips hit his. He kept his hands on her breasts, tweaking the nipples and playing with the mounds as she tilted her head back and lifted herself up off him, then slid back down again. Her hands braced against his chest, she raised herself up and down several times, sighing as he tilted his hips and sunk a little deeper, hitting a sensitive spot deep inside her. Matt's hands found her hips and he lifted her up off him, helping her find a rhythm that soon had her screaming again. The feel of her body clenching around him drove him past his tenuous control, and he came with a shout. Alex collapsed against his chest, her breath coming in gasps. Wow. You can say that again. He wrapped his arms around her and held her like the precious gift she was. The next morning, Matt slid out of bed, leaving Alex sleeping. He glanced at her on his way out of the room. She looked peaceful and angelic. He knew sleeping was the only chance he'd have to see that, the angelic part at least. She was too driven and independent to ever look that way while awake. His chest ached as he pulled the door closed and went downstairs. He made a pot of coffee, poured himself a cup, and went out on the front porch to sit. The night before had been wonderful, but now he felt guilty. He hadn't been with anyone since Connie died, and while in his head he knew she would want him to be happy, his chest ached with a sense of having betrayed her memory. Not by the sex, but with the emotion he felt for Alex that overshadowed what he'd had with Connie. He drank his coffee and tried to get his heart to understand what his brain already knew. He'd loved Connie and part of him always would, but Alex was his mate, she would truly be part of him. He sat there as the sun rose and the day started to warm. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but when the sun hit his face, something deep inside him warmed, something he couldn't attribute to the sunshine. The ache in his heart faded, and he somehow knew Connie was okay with Alex, and everything that mattered would be okay. With nothing else to do, he stayed and watched the animals move around until the floor inside creaked, telling him Alex was up. He drained his cup and went inside. It was time to make breakfast for his girl. He'd made up his mind he would be moving in, and unless Alex didn't agree, it wouldn't be into a spare room. That was, of course, if he could get his Khan's approval.